Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Hi everyone and welcome once again to the SportsPro Podcast. My name is Owen Connolly. I'm the editor-at-large at SportsPro. Good to have you back with us. Hope you're all very well. Now, in recent weeks we've been having and we've been hearing a lot of conversations about race. And you don't need, I hope, a sports industry podcast to tell you why that is. Protests that have swept across the world, beginning in the US after the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers late last month. There's been anger at the circumstances of Floyd's death and of other similar outrages. But there's also been an appetite for asking difficult questions about systemic racism and about the structures that perpetuate inequality. It's probably a good time for us to take a look at ourselves and at the work that we do and what we can do better. And when I consider the two industries that I work across, sport and the media here in the UK, my feelings are that there's plenty that can be done. Sport is an incredible force for unity, and those who excel in it and are celebrated for that excellence can come from anywhere. It's followed by diverse groups of people, and it's played at every level by diverse groups of people. But the people who run it and those who cover it too often represent a very narrow band of experience. And I think that's a criticism that can be levelled at us at SportsPro as well. So what do we do about it? How do we move from a conversation about systemic racism to constructive measures? How do we go from warm sentiment and statements of support to real progress? Well, our guest today is Leon Mann, a journalist, consultant and filmmaker who is the founder of the Black Collective of Media in Sport, which he set up in 2009 to create a network for journalists, producers, presenters, researchers, production managers and editors, and to improve the representation of Black people in sports media. Leon started his career with the football anti-racism campaign Kick It Out. He's also the co-founder of The Blacklist, which celebrates the achievements of Black figures in British football, of the Sports People's Think Tank, and of the On the Board corporate governance course aimed at giving former professional athletes and diverse candidates the tools to get into the boardroom. And as well as all that, he is a broadcaster who has made documentaries with Usain Bolt and done profile interviews with some of the biggest names in international sport. Well, I spoke to Leon earlier this week about what goes into organising those networks, about his professional experiences of sports media and of the sports industry, the cultural and commercial implications of a lack of diversity in business as well as media, and about the practical steps big and small organisations can take to bring about meaningful change. Hopefully, it's an interesting, enlightening, and useful chat. Here's Leon.
You're listening to the SportsPro Podcast.
Leon Mann, founder of the Black Collective of Media in Sport. Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm not bad, Leon. How are you? And first of all, what's your reaction been to the events of the last couple of weeks?
In all honesty, in terms of how I am as an individual, and I know a lot of this will resonate with a lot of Black people who are listening to this. I mean, I'm exhausted, I'm drained emotionally, but in terms of the need to drive forward, it's not a time to be tired. It's a time to look at what we can do proactively to help our respective industries. So that's what my focus is on. And in terms of what we've seen over the last few weeks, in terms of Black Lives Matter, and the outpouring of calls for change, for me, I really do hope every industry, in particular because I'm within it, the sports industry, takes this opportunity to make real changes that will help the health of their business. This is not just about being nice to Black people. It's not just about that. That is part of this. But there's a strong business case behind being more diverse that we've seen in various academic research. So let's be better as an industry.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you talked about it a bit there. There's the kind of personal and the human reaction to all that's going on, and then there's analysing what's actually happening, how organisations are reacting, how public figures are reacting, and whether we're getting something that's constructive or something that's kind of, I think that the branding term is hygienic. Whether it's being seen to be taking the right position rather than doing the right thing. I mean, do you feel like, just from what we've seen so far, do you feel like this is a different moment from what we've had, perhaps in the years that you've been involved in this kind of work?
Well, this has been a big area of debate within the Black community. I was on a podcast recently, and we were debating whether this was a moment where we believe the industry would change. I think we're cautiously optimistic. I think is probably a view from the Black community at the moment. I'm always hesitant to offer a view onto, in terms of a large group of people, of course, but we've had lots of moments. It was only 18 months ago that in the sports media, we had Raheem Sterling, through his Instagram post, really shake up a lot of those newsrooms. People were reporting on problems within their own industry, pretty much for the first time in that way. And we felt, right, this is a big moment for change. And don't get me wrong, some things did change. I think we've seen some more Black presenters appear on screen. Certainly, an organisation, and I don't want to get into calling out different organisations, but I think in terms of what an organisation like Talk Sport, for example, has done, Hugh Wozencroft is a Black presenter that is part of Talk Sport. I'm not saying it was because of Raheem Sterling, but there's a show that they have on Thursday nights, which is almost exclusively Black contributors. These are things that I think it's fair, and I think people at Talksport would agree that was unheard of before. And if you look at who won the SJA Broadcaster of the Year, surprise, surprise, it was Talksport, and within the citation, it was mentioned that that they had diversified their talent. So there's already one example of the success of increased diversity. So let's hope. But for somebody like me, a campaigner, somebody who's trying to drive change, I have to believe that we have an opportunity here, and that's why we are, as BComs and all the other various organisations that are working in and around equality, are pushing particularly hard at the moment, because we've seen the social media posts from various media outlets and sports organisations, and we want to make sure that we're not just doing the symbolic. The symbolic is very important. Don't get me wrong. The Premier League having Black Lives Matter on the shirts is significant. However, if it is just that, that is the change, that is not enough. And I know that I'm close to people at the Premier League, at the FA, etc. I know that it won't just be that, but we have to make sure it is the right things that are as effective as possible, and that involves Black people being central to these solutions, and involved in driving them forward.
Now, I want to take a step back in a second and look at BComs and the story of it, and the work that you've done over the last few years. But just to stay in this moment for now, what are some of the positive signs that you're looking for? Basically, where are you seeing tangible things, as opposed to that gloss, that emphasis on the symbolic?
Well, for me, we have to approach this work in the way that we would in any area um, of our business. As in, we have to look at timelines. What's going to change within what timeline? So we have to be open about that. We have to look at, what the budget is, because that essentially tells us all how important this work is within a business. We have to look at who's accountable. Somebody has to say, this is on me. And for me, that has to be a managing director or a CEO or chairperson. And they have to be accountable in the way of having external scrutiny, and people don't like that within business. But if you have, for years and years and years, decades, in fact, been failing in this area, something has to change in terms of the level of scrutiny around your work in this area. I think those are three key areas, as well as engaging experts in what you're doing. If we were looking at a technical issue within the industry, there is no way we would have people who are not qualified, who don't have the expertise, tinkering with something with the objective of changing it because it's important to the business. That wouldn't happen. And that's my feeling. My feeling is that the various industry leaders want to change this, but perhaps would put it into a box that's marked charity work, which is nice to do, but not essential for the business. I want that moved right onto the business agenda, where it is seen as key to the health of the business. So that involves some of the leaders going on a journey to understanding why this is important, and all the academic research is out there for people to access. However, I just believe that this isn't about people not caring about black people necessarily. I think it's not important enough for somebody to sit down and be fully focused on this and treat it as a business objective. And we need a change in attitude in that respect to really drive the change that we're all talking about.
Now, this is something that you sought to apply pressure with through BComs. Before that, you were involved with the Blacklist, which was a means of highlighting, the contributions of Black people within football in the UK. And you've been involved in various other organisations that have sought to highlight and also work with organisations on these kind of on improving representation and the way that leadership is composed and the way that where you're recruiting from and everything else. Let's just go back to your story personally. How you were involved with the BBC, and you're a journalist basically by training initially.
Yeah, I mean, I've got an interesting career journey to date, because I started work. My very first job in the sports industry was as the media spokesperson for the Kick It Out campaign. So back then, the slogan was "Kick Racism Out of Football." It's gone on to be about wider diversity as well as racism, of course. So I spent I think about 7 years working there as my first job out of university. So I was involved in liaising with the media on various issues of racism that would come up, and I'd also be trying to get them to cover some of the proactive stories around what clubs, associations were trying to do to raise awareness of racism in football. So it was a really interesting place to work. Very small organisation. Back then, I think we had six full-time staff, of which I was one of them. I think today the organisation has grown by about three times, I believe, but still now it's still seen, and the people there will tell you that they are heavily under-resourced. Um, so it was an interesting place to work. Got a lot of access to the leaders in football, because it was a small organisation. So if the director couldn't make a meeting, I'd be going along to it. So I think at the age of 23, I was off to a meeting with Sepp Blatter, which was very interesting in my young years, listening to him talk about racism in football at that time. Yeah, and then I moved from Kick It Out to the BBC. I went in at entry level. As a young person, I'd always wanted to be a sports journalist, but never believed I could be one. The reason for that was I looked at the television, and the black people I saw involved in the area of journalism I wanted to go into, be that presenting or reporting, were former players, former sports people, who'd achieved incredible success, gold medals in Olympics, hundreds of appearances in the top flight. So my feeling was I had no chance at all getting an opportunity in that area, because I was okay at sport, but I certainly was nowhere near a gold medal in the Olympics, and certainly nowhere near hundreds of appearances in football. So I moved to the BBC, and had a really enjoyable time. I kind of think it's important for me to stress that, because when I'm talking about the lack of diversity, etc., I'm talking about difficult, sensitive things. but actually my experience of working there was positive. However, the lack of diversity struck me massively when I was in the building. And coming from a campaigning background, I needed to make change some way. So that's where Becoms was born from, because I'd had access through Kick It Out and my previous job to the entire industry, so I could identify where the black sports journalists were. I decided to pull everybody together, to have a unified voice, and to work out what the solutions could potentially be going forward. And it was a really interesting mix of ideas at that time, because some people wanted to do educational work. My instinct was to do lobbying and campaigning work with the bosses across the industry to get them to change. Others, were very focused on mentoring, and the next generation in that respect. So collectively, we were able to begin to make some strides forward. And yeah, having left the BBC in 2013 to go into freelance work as a reporter, I've ended up doing some consultancy work, looking at working in talent management. I've continued working as a filmmaker and producer. So I've really got a big portfolio. I think they call it a portfolio career now, which can be very confusing to people, because I'm dealing with people with lots of different hats. However, I do believe that this is kind of what it looks like for many people in the sports industry, because of all the different moving parts and the way that it's evolved. And I enjoy it. I enjoy the freedom and flexibility to work on different projects, and feel very blessed to be in this industry.
You talk about your experience of the BBC and being struck by the lack of diversity. I mean, some of the statistics that BComs have shared about press in the UK, of those 338 people who covered major sporting events in 2018, including the FIFA World Cup, Winter Olympics and Paralympics, Wimbledon, the Commonwealth Games, and the European Championships, multi-sports event. 32 came from a BAME background, and of those 32, only 5 were not previously associated with professional sport. No BAME women in any of the 109 newspaper roles, and only 1 black writer of either gender attending the World Cup. I mean, that puts into numbers what I think those of us who work in this industry will already be kind of anecdotally and aware of by feeling. What do you think? You've explained that you've kind of taken a slightly unconventional route into reporting yourself, but what do you think is at the root of that lack of representation? Because sport, I think, it's important to put it in the context of sport. What people see on their television is lots of athletes from lots of different backgrounds, but the industry behind it, I don't think it's just the media, but the media is kind of is where all the commentary is filtered through, and it's where all the conversation is filtered through. Is just not reflective of that side of things, of where the athlete's coming from.
Yeah, I mean, it's not reflective of many of the sports, and it's certainly not reflective of the societies that we live in. And given where the majority of sports media are based and have been based historically, being London, London's ethnic minority population, is around 40%. So it's deeply uncomfortable for many of us who've been working within the sports media and traveling to work on a pretty diverse looking tube to get off and go into our workplaces, covering a very diverse sport at times. Certainly, if it's football, boxing, or athletics, is 3 just randomly, and looking around our newsroom, our departments, and feeling, that the lack of diversity. I mean, the why is something which is being or has been explored for some time. My personal feeling is, if we look at who the hirers are, and if we kind of follow the science, if you like, that we tend to see and define best in our own image. So, for example, maybe I, as a black guy of mixed race, would see best in my own image. So if I was recruiting, there's a chance that I would be recruiting for someone who looks and sounds and is a bit like me, for example. So if you have an industry where the vast majority of hirers are white middle class men, it's unsurprising that we end up with a hugely over representation of white middle class men. And and in terms of how we define best, I think it's the traditional way of defining best is by looking at what university did you go to. I think that's something that's commonplace across all industries. So I think the combination of the two things, means that particular candidates, are seen as different, are seen as a risk. I've certainly felt in my career, as much as I was supported by some incredible people, that I was always seen as a risk. Now, in terms of what I did within my career in a very short time, particularly looking at the BBC, I moved from being, a broadcast assistant to assistant producer to a reporter within the space of about 18 months, which is pretty much unheard of. Now, that's for someone who was taking a risk on. I'd made, two films on Usain Bolt for the BBC. I had, become a reporter eventually for the Olympics, a feature reporter. So I was able, within a short space of time, relatively, to achieve some incredible things. But I feel that was partly because, I was in front of the most senior bosses in the building because I was talking about the lack of diversity within the organisation. And that's not me saying that they gave me those opportunities because I was giving them a hard time. I don't think it was that at all. I think the dynamic in some of those meetings was quite difficult in terms of the communication. But I do think because I was in front of them, I was able to impress them. And I think if you are a black person within the industry who is not able to get in front of the leaders and not able to challenge maybe some of their thoughts on the abilities of particular people because they're not engaging with them on a day-to-day basis, then their chances are slim in terms of moving forward. So I think we need to create opportunities to get talented people from Black and Asian minority ethnic backgrounds in front of key decision makers. And I think we need to educate many of the middle management who are responsible for a lot of the recruitment into businesses. My experience of middle managers has been that they are so focused on the short term that actually they don't have time to be thinking about the importance of diversity. They just want to get somebody in who's going to be able to do things exactly the same as the person before, because they need to get a show out or they need to get a product out. They are worried that somebody who is different in appearance, educational background, etc., is going to be somebody who doesn't do it the same way the guy did it before. So I think these are all challenges that are easy to to change, but with the right leadership. Is the leadership aware of all of these things? Are they engaged properly with all of these challenges, and are they able to make decisions, enforce decisions on middle managers to make sure that they are considering all the applicants and and have a key understanding of diversity.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about, because the sports industry is full of smaller companies, basically, but it's also an industry, uh, and it's also an industry that doesn't have kind of linear career paths dotted around the place. It's not an industry that's heavily, a lot of people will be university educated or similar, if they haven't come through a sports career, and there will be a level of expectation around capability, but beyond that, it's not like being a doctor or an accountant. There's no professional qualification involved. There's quite often not the no tangible output in some roles, or if there is, it's not necessarily related to professional development. It's related to other things. What kind of pressures does that create on someone who's coming into an industry like that?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that, there are plenty of Black and Asian people going to university. So in terms of having that qualification, if that's the agreed requirement to be able to get in for that particular role, there should be there's enough Black and Asian people to be applying based on that. Now, where
I mean, not sorry, just I just feel like I should clarify the question a little bit because it's less a question of people aren't going to university, but it's more that there are a lot of jobs for which the qualifications that you have on paper are not necessarily going to be the the basis on which a hiring person makes a decision, the recruiter makes a decision.
So there's a greater flexibility, is what you're saying, for getting into the sports media. So, for example, I've got a geography degree, and from having a geography degree, I decided I didn't want to work for the Ordnance Survey or pursue a career in that space, and wanted to go for my dream, which was working in the sports industry. So, managed somehow to get into the Kick It Out campaign, and then gained experience at that point. And I think we see that a lot. A lot of the people who come to BComs are after a career change. They're people with first class degrees in many cases, working in different industries, but they really want to get into the sports media. They really want to be part of that because they're obsessed with sport, they're obsessed with storytelling, and they're committed to making a change. And like myself, took I had to take a pretty significant pay cut to get into to make the move across to the BBC at the time, because I'd worked up in the industry, and knew that I'd have to make a sacrifice to get in, and that's fine because it doesn't matter if you're black or white. That's the same sacrifice that everybody potentially would have to make if they're making a move from one industry to the other. So I do think that actually there's flexibility and opportunity in and around that, and I think this applies more broadly to when we're talking about a lack of black representation, Asian representation in the boardrooms across sport. The Telegraph ran a fantastic story last week. I mean, I was about to say it didn't tell us anything we didn't know, but I mean, obviously it is news, so it did tell us something we didn't know in terms of the lack of representation across the sports boards. But then sports response seems to be, yeah, but there's no one with real experience to come and do this. Now I look across sports boards and I kind of see all sorts of people, from accountants to lawyers, people with different skill sets, as you would expect for a board. So why aren't we going to the city to find those highly skilled, experienced, intelligent Black and Asian people who are obsessed with football or sport, whichever sport, because they exist, they're there, and they would be able to bring not only diversity, but what we need in these boards, which is exceptional skills. So why aren't we doing that? Why that seems to be a pretty basic thing for me. And in terms of other things that are not being done, we're often told, oh well, we just can't find very we can't find candidates from Black and Asian communities to come in to the sports industry and work at a senior level. Now, I just don't see what I'm unaware of sports industry initiatives that go into red brick universities and identify, the African Caribbean society, or the various other groups that are there in their second year, as they do in the city. Many of my friends who went to Oxford and Cambridge were headhunted in their second year to go into the industries that they went into. Those are the very basic things that sport needs to do. It's not doing that at the moment, as far as I'm aware. It's certainly not doing it in a visible way, which would be helpful in terms of that encouragement to people. And these are the kind of what I see as quite basic things that needs to happen if we're really truly committed, and understand this as a business objective around diversity.
I'm going to pick up on that point in just a sec, but just in terms of at the other end of things, away from the board level, going down to entry level and getting people getting people into sports media and into the sports industry more widely. Do you see a lot of younger people who feel like there is no place for me there, so I'm going to pursue something else, basically? And whether that's pre-university stage or whether that's at graduate stage, are there lots of people who are put off put off by how monocultural the sports industry seems to be?
Yes, 100%. I think, look, going into any professional industry, right? So without highlighting sport necessarily, going into any professional industry, as a black person, as an Asian person, you were going to be heavily underrepresented. So I don't think anyone kind of goes into it expecting their workplace to look like the communities that many of us have grown up in. We have realistic expectations of our workplace. However, having those expectations and going into a workplace and surviving a workplace in terms of being the only black person in the department is another reality. And in terms of those young people who come to try and get access to the industry, I think many of them um, just are so put off by having rejection after rejection that all right, there might be some young white people listening to this say that's my experience too. But if you have another layer where you're questioning if you're being rejected partly because you're black or identifiable because of your name in the application, then that's another reason on top of how competitive it is to get in to walk away. Now, what BComs tries to do in terms of the sports media is we, try and, because of the need to increase diversity, we try and make sure that there are some informal ways of meeting bosses, seeing what the workplaces look like, and understanding that they will be supported when they are within the workplace. So they have a greater encouragement to come forward and get involved. My own experience, I didn't for 1 minute ever think I was going to be able to work within the sports media until I went to Kick It Out. And then when I was at Kick It Out as a campaign, I was able to work with the sports media and identify someone like a Darren Lewis or a Rodney Hines, a Hepburn Harrison Graham. These are people within the industry who I thought, oh, right, well, if they're in there and they're surviving and they're not from any professional sports backgrounds, then actually maybe I do have a chance, and maybe I should give this a go. And actually, those are the reasons that I did give it a go in the end, because I felt like I could potentially do something, and also I had encouragement from some fantastic people, Shelley Alexander at the BBC, Nick Dixon at the BBC. These are individuals, and neither of those people that I just mentioned there are black, but they are individuals who were there to for me if things became difficult. And just knowing that made a huge difference. And that's what Becoms is kind of trying to do in terms of being that group that's external to be able to come to for advice, to be able to come to identify issues, and then we can in turn raise those without identifying people if that's necessary, to find solutions and to try and retain some of that talent within the industry. The challenge we have as BComs is that we're doing this work completely unfunded in volunteer hours. So in terms of how professionally we can go about our business, there's a limit to that at the moment. And because of our visibility in the sports industry, there's an expectation that is beyond our means. So that's why at the moment we're having some, very, direct, honest conversations with the industry in terms of how they do value becomes. Because for us to have a real, true impact that we know we can have, we need a more formalized relationship, and we need a greater commitment, and we need to become part of the accountability, quite frankly, because for us we've been sat watching people make mistakes for 10 years, when actually if we had a bit more responsibility and accountability within that, then I think we could play a greater role in guiding the industry, to make sure that they have a voice of the black community, that is helping to guide them, because that's really lacking at the moment.
Help us spread the word about the SportsPro Podcast. Subscribe, like and share our content on social. Join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag SportsProPod. And if you're enjoying our work, why not leave us a rating and a nice review on your podcast platform of choice? And if you want to get in touch, you can send us an email, podcast@sportspromedia.com. The Sports Pro Podcast. We're listening too.
We've got a generation of athletes at the moment, not just here in the UK, but internationally, but who are not afraid to express themselves when it comes to social issues. Raheem Sterling, who you've already mentioned, is not afraid to bring up quite difficult conversations, quite difficult questions around race. We've seen Marcus Rashford this week, doing some really impressive work around the preschool meals in this country for young kids who are obviously not at school at the moment. As striking and as remarkable as some of these examples are they a symptom of that lack of representation in the media as well? The fact that you're having young guys Marcus Rashford is 22, 23 years old, who, as well as being professional athletes, are putting themselves out to bring up issues that perhaps there aren't other people who might have a more suitable platform to do that in the mainstream media for them.
I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, I think if there was greater diversity in the sports media, I think we would have a greater thoroughness, a wider editorial net, and be more reflective of what the nation is interested in and engaged with, and sees as important across our, sports pages and broadcasts. Quite frankly, thank God for social media, because I think that has been the device that has enabled these sports people, such as Raheem, such as Marcus Rashford, and many others, Eniola Luco, to be able to raise things themselves without relying on an industry. It was interesting. Just the other day, Marcus Rashford's asking on Twitter who he should be writing to about this issue around school meals. That the fact that he's done that through his social media, shows you just how organic this is all happening. Now, without social media, Marcus is reliant on relationships, and to be honest, at 22, who knows what kind of relationships you or your agent, then you rely on your agent to care about these things, would have to be able to make the points that he's making in the way that he's making to the numbers of people that he's making. So social media has really been a game changer there. But yes, absolutely, a more diverse sports media does a better job. That's the business case that I keep bringing people back to, when they keep telling me that they're doing their best. For me, this is about being better as a business, and this applies to every single business. You have a greater thoroughness of editorial process if you have people sat around that table, who are bringing different perspectives on a story, and that can be a story on anything. It doesn't have to be a black issue or a working class issue. It can be absolutely anything that's put into the middle of that table to be knocked around. But if you have people with different perspectives, you're going to get a greater thoroughness, and you're going to, as part of that thoroughness, come to a decision which has been based on, properly exploring all the angles and why it is important to do that story in the way that you will decide as a team to do it.
Yeah, and I mean that business case, like I said, it speaks to a wider issue. We've talked for a couple of years about the change that sport is going through as an industry, the pressures that come from, different ways that people watch things, other different types of consumption, and the way that media has changed kind of on a macro level, over the last decade and in the years ahead, the kind of move to digital and the need to understand more and in greater detail what your audience is thinking. I mean, it strikes me that that's a huge blind spot if the people who are interpreting that information are all coming from a similar background.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I see it as guesswork. And often people will ask me about young audiences. And I'll have to remind them that I'm 40 years old. So, I was young once upon a time as they were. But, I do feel like I have some expertise in younger audiences, but I'm certainly not young. So, how are we as an industry getting like real views from young people? How are they trusting us as an industry if we feel completely foreign to them in terms of them being able to communicate their true ideas and trusting us to be able to deliver them in the right way. I think there's a lot going on there, and actually, I do believe that greater diversity helps. And when I say greater diversity, I think sometimes we can confuse greater diversity for having three black people around the table, one Asian person, blah blah blah. It's actually diversity in every single way. So that also does involve age. And of course, look, you're not going to sit a 10-year-old around the table necessarily in a board meeting, right? But I think you can have the input of younger people in a way that allows them to contribute more directly, and they are listened to, and they are a voice that helps to guide the business in terms of what they should be doing. It shouldn't just be based on focus groups. I think we can have younger voices within the workplace contributing at the top table if we can give them the confidence to be able to do that.
You sent a letter last week to various media outlets, co-signed by people like Dina Asher Smith and David Beckham and Eni Aluko, who you've mentioned as well, and also people who you haven't previously worked with, Gabby Logan and Laura Woods. So people from athletes and former athletes and writers and presenters as well. First of all, I guess just what was the detail of that letter? What kind of things were you setting out there?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, to be fair to the industry leaders, I won't go into the detail of each point. But we have 7 points, and I don't think to any diversity experts they'll be hugely surprising. They're very much aligned with what diversity experts are asking um, of every industry. I think one of them that I'm happy to share is around the monitoring and evaluation and reviewing of the progress that we're making. Because if this is just solely left to businesses to do themselves, then how much scrutiny is involved in that in terms of moving us forward. I think it would be useful to everybody in the sports media industry and indeed the wider sports industry, although that should sit separately, to have a way of monitoring how we're doing in this area. Because and some of the businesses, of course, will respond to us in due course and tell us that they're doing that. They'll be doing that independently, and they'll in terms of what the breakdown of that looks like. Okay, well, does that show us what senior management levels look like? Does that look like entry level, mid management? Does it show us the changes? They may come back to us individually and tell us that it does all those things. But at the moment, we feel there needs to be greater transparency in what the monitoring and evaluation looks like in terms of this progress, because it feels like it's down to an unfunded voluntary organisation like BComs to have to go through the visible areas of diversity for it to be put on the map and discussed in a real robust way. The stats that you went through earlier in terms of the 338 roles that we went through for those major events, that shook the industry. And that's just the visible diversity, where actually I kind of feel the industry has made some good progress in many ways, certainly since 2018. But that's just what you see on screen. Someone could cynically say that's the window dressing. But actually, what does it look like in your boardroom? What does it look like in your leadership positions? What does it look like in terms of the people hiring and firing? Because those are vital roles where you need diversity. And I'm that letter has been sent from my email address, so I'm receiving the responses from the bosses, of which I know many of them from our work over the years. I don't want to speak too soon, but the responses have all been very open to change. so far. So I'm hopeful we can really get down into the action points that we've put to them, and where they're not doing something, I don't want them to make excuses, because it will be very obvious to us if it's being done or not done. And if it's not being done, we want to be part of the solution. This isn't about calling people out and trying to embarrass anybody. What this is about is trying to move the industry on, to accelerate the levels of progress, and to make sure that it's monitored in some way that we can all sit down together as an industry and say, right, we're doing better here. We're achieving these things here. We're getting close to the goals that we've set in place, and maybe the goals should be changed now, because actually we've learned so much on this journey over the last 2 years that we need to look at, what works for the industry in terms of accelerating even more change in different areas of our business, because there's a real opportunity at this point to get some focus. And it's a difficult time for every industry because of COVID-19, but I also think it does open up an opportunity for businesses to reflect on how they rebuild because of COVID-19. So this is a time for pausing, looking at something and saying, how are we going to do this differently? How am I as a leader going to be able to, create some real legacy here by doing things in a different way? Because for the last 10 years that we've been working and alongside BComs, our progress hasn't been to the level that we know we want it to be. So how do we change that going forward? How do we ensure that, when we started BComs, people were saying there's not really the applicants. 10 years later, they're still saying the same thing. So that's 10 years of development of people. That's 10 years of going into schools, going into colleges, going into universities, if that was the method. That's been wasted, or that's not been done properly. So we want to be part of ensuring that the next 5, 10 years is done in a different way.
I mean, the sports industry is, as we've mentioned a couple of times, is it's composed of a lot of, with a few exceptions, it's composed of a lot of small and SME kind of scale businesses. And lots of them, and I include SportsPro in this. There's not many outliers when it comes to diversity. Lots of them are, in the same position when it comes to this, and would like to do a better job. What are some of the practical things that you can do at that scale to start bringing people in from a wider range of backgrounds, and perhaps not just looking at diversity as an outcome, but looking at how you can change your recruitment processes, how you can change the way you think about where you look for talent?
I think it's about working in partnership with people with the right expertise. For example, we meet as BComs, or I meet as out there in the industry, plenty of people who've got jobs at a BBC or Sky or BT, and they will tell me, "Oh, I'm really pleased. I saw this job on the BComs website," and I would have had no idea about who would have applied and the process, because as BComs, unless you tell us, we're not likely to know because of where we are at the moment as an organisation. And then I've asked them. I said, "Okay, well, in future, can you let us know about these things? Because it's really interesting that you decided to apply for this job at this place, and you felt that you could do it or wanted to do it more because it was on the BCom site." Because those are the kind of things that they were saying to me. They were saying, "Look, Leon, we felt because there was a relationship with BComs, because it was on your site, so you trusted them with that job, because it was on your social media, that there was an encouragement to us to apply." Um, and I've, that's so important. That really is so important, that a business is seen to care and seen to be wanting to get jobs into the right places. Now, for us, it's been a really interesting journey, because we at one point just went around looking for jobs across the industry and putting them on our website, and then promoting them through our social media. And I remember one occasion, because these jobs are done largely by interns and volunteers. One organisation wrote us a very direct email, shall we say, saying that we'd used the wrong logo of their company, and that we must take it down straight away. So we ended up taking the job down. But I think that kind of shows sometimes a lack of understanding of the value of becoms, and putting it up um, in our networks. I think that's a big thing. So working in partnership with experts, treating this in the same way, if you had something technical within your business that you needed to change, you would you would look for someone who could come in and change those technical things to make your business perform in a better way. Take the same approach around diversity, inclusion, and equality work. A lot of the time people are like, well, we just need to just advertise with a diverse partner. And of course, as I've just detailed, that can make a real impact if it's done in the right way. But there'll be lots of other things, and they'll be kind of tailored to your own business, to the things you're already doing, to things that you can do differently, the kind of content that you're putting out, the way you're putting the content out. I mean, I look at somebody like Benny Bonsu, who is, the sports editor at Give Me Sport Women. Now, she went into that business and was given an opportunity to obviously get her workforce, get her group of freelancers together. And I remember this really clearly. She put on her Twitter account, "I'm looking for freelancers. Really would like to have a big pool of female freelancers." Now that tweet must have been retweeted, hundreds and hundreds of times, and you could see the replies, and you could see Benny getting back to them. And I think she lined up something like 50 interviews across a couple of weeks with freelancers, and she managed to do something that many of the other outlets were saying was impossible. They were telling me, "Oh, look, we really struggle with female freelancers. We can't find any." And because the messenger is right in Benny, because they trust her, because the platform is right in terms of, that's where many freelancers are, she's managed to achieve something that actually probably a lot of money's been thrown at in other organizations, and they failed. And that's because, she has an understanding of her audience, and her audience trusts her. And that's one thing that Becoms brings to the table, is a lot of trust. You know, um, we are a black-led organization. Anybody can join our organization. You just need to be part of our mailing list, come along to our events. We have, lots and lots of, white progressive people wanting to be part of what we're doing and benefiting from what we're doing, because they'll see the same jobs, they're part of our mailing list. And that's all good, because, we want to help, the entire industry. So I do think it is about partnerships. I do think it's about working with those people who understand the dynamics of different communities, because there's, within the Black community, there's different communities. Within the Asian community, there's certainly different communities, and understand, some of those reservations and how you can address them and build confidence. So I think those principles apply whether you're a BBC or a Sky or BT, um, to whether you're a much smaller business that also wants to ensure that it's doing as much as it can to make sure it's attracting diverse applicants, and operating in the most business effective way by having a diverse team.
Finally, Leon, just what needs to happen next in this area? There's a lot of profile at the moment. There's it's a cultural moment that's happening right now, and we've seen these things happen before, and sometimes it brings something tangible and lasting, and sometimes it doesn't. So for this industry, what needs to happen next in order to make sure that there is something that comes out of this?
I think there's a number of things. First of all, let's be transparent on our targets. Let's set those targets, and work really hard to achieving them. So we know where we are. Let's have a timeline for those targets, in terms of what we want our industries and businesses to look like within a certain time frame. Let's have an understanding, and Sky have come out with their Black Lives Matter tweet, I think last week, where they talked about £30 million that they'll be spending with black organisations in terms of upping their game as a company. So we don't know how that money is going to be spent, over what period of time, etc. That detail I haven't had access to anyway at this point. But I think that's the kind of thing that makes people sit up and show that a company is certainly looking at taking this seriously, because they've attached a budget to it, and in this case a hugely significant one. And let's know who's accountable. Who's the person who's going to drive this. It has to be the CEO, MD. It has to be those people that drive this. It can't be lobbing it into the diversity and inclusion group. Or if it's in the diversity and inclusion group, I need to know that the MD and the CEO are turning up to those meetings, so that they're engaged in that. That this is on the business objectives for the company, and not just sat separately at a monthly diversity meeting where there's no real accountability or no urgency from across the business. Because normally in those groups you have lots of people who are very committed, but can feel powerless, is my experience. They can feel they're putting ideas forward that just don't have the support of the business. So we need to change that culture. And lastly, maybe the most important thing is work with experts. I kind of use the analogy of, if my TV is broken, I'll fiddle around with it for a little bit, but trust me, I'm going to end up going to someone who knows how to fix it eventually. And actually, when they fix it, you think, oh, geez, that was quite simple. I wish I'd done it ages ago. So I really do think there's a similar situation here with addressing diversity in the sports industry. I think we're fiddling around. We're not really getting experts in. We're not really giving them the support and respect that they perhaps deserve, or not perhaps, that they do deserve. And we're working to very clear business guidelines. It can't be. This looks a bit hard, and it's a bit sensitive, and it's difficult for us to talk about race as white leaders. It can't be that anymore. We're past that. We're now at the stage of real serious plans, serious targets, consequences to targets not being met. All of those things that you would expect with any other area of your business. We need all of those applied to this area. And if we get on with that, if we get to that stage swiftly, if we get the support of the likes of if it needs external pressure from the likes of UK Sport England, DCMS, the government, we need all of these these bodies, these groups to apply the necessary pressure to force change if it's not forthcoming, because it hasn't been forthcoming in the time that I've been working in the sports industry, which is 20 years now. So we need to do things differently. That's the bottom line, and that was the top line of our letter to all the sports media industry bosses. What are you going to do differently?
Leon, thanks very much.
Thank you.
The SportsPro Podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.